Good evening, everyone. Emory Moynagh here for Creation Biology. And today we're going to be reviewing a paper by Chad Arment. This was published in Answers Research Journal toward the end of 2022. And it's been on my radar for about a month to work on, but I've just been busy doing other things. I'm starting to keep a notebook, though, of all the papers that I read and whether I want to talk about them or not. Arment's paper, published November 30, 2022, is entitled Ruminating on Created Kinds and Archekinds. Now, Arment is, in a sense, responding to a paper that was published by Gene Leitner. We've reviewed that paper. That paper, I believe, has gone up on the Creation Biology podcast, where Leitner argues that the created kinds did not have to equal the archekinds. And I think Arment has nailed down why this is, why she's making that argument. I wondered about it at the time. I couldn't figure out why she was making that argument. Because she holds to a higher flood, post-flood boundary. Now, what that means effectively is that there's less time to diversify after the flood, and that the organisms found higher up in the flood, post-flood boundary are... if there's crossover between the layers, so in other words, the Pliocene Pleistocene is the higher post-flood boundary put forward by Dr. Tim Clary, and I'll try and put up on the screen a image of what the geologic column looks like and where that post-flood boundary would be. But it's not my purpose here to talk so much about that as to talk about Arment's paper. So I'm going to read the abstract, and then I'm going to read bits and chunks of the paper as we go along. So here's how Arment's paper starts. Understanding the relationship between created kinds and archekinds is a key issue in creation science, especially as it has bearing on the flood post-flood boundary debate. This paper first considers whether there is a classification terminology in the Old Testament that represents the creationist concept of the Baraminology. Then three possible ways archekinds could relate to the created kinds are evaluated with biostratigraphic data. Evidence from the fossil record narrows the possible understanding of archekinds, shedding light on the challenges in the flood post-flood boundary debate. So the first thing he talks about is whether or not that there is a classification scheme in Scripture. And he argues that there is, but it's different from a biological one. And I think there's some merit to the fact that there is a classification system in Scripture. However, he follows the Todd Wood argumentation line that min does not equal a biological classification, which it might not in all cases. I don't think it has to. But the meaning of a word is determined by its context. And I think this is what Wood and Arment and others miss when they talk about the word min, is that the meaning of a word is determined by the context of said word. And in context, in certain places, particularly in Genesis 7 and Genesis 9, it's very clear what the word kind means. It means a reproductive group. And since that's what we're arguing about, where the post-flood boundary is, I don't see why Arment doesn't make that distinction in his paper. Now, Mr. Arment, if you should happen to see this podcast, and you should happen to not agree with my characterizations of anything that you've said, feel free to send me an email. I will, bare minimum, read your concerns on the air and respond to them. However, that's up to you. So, my argument with the word min has always been is the word, like the word day, is determined by its context. So the word min can mean a non-biological classification, as when it's used in the, or a non-biological group, as when it's used in the dietary laws. But it also can mean a biological classification, as when it's used in the archekinds, for example, and also the created kinds. I think in those cases it does have a biological meaning. Doesn't necessarily have to, but it can have that meaning. And I'll just point out to you that the word species that we use today has multiple meanings that you determine by context. The word speciation has multiple meanings. It's used in chemistry. That has nothing to do with the formation of new biological species. So, being able to understand a word by its context, I think, is key here, and that's something that Arment misses in this discussion. He does get into the dietary laws a little bit. Now, he wants to appeal to the dietary laws as his primary point of contention. However, when he's what effectively is saying is that not everything within that kind necessarily is clean in the dietary laws. And again, I'd agree with him. But the point of the matter is not whether the dietary laws are giving a biological classification. I don't think they are, and I don't think they were ever intended to be. But Genesis 7, Genesis 9, I think they are. I think that's the difference. Now, that leads us into the more important discussion, which is arc kinds versus created kinds. And he cites the Leitner paper from 2021, where Leitner said, and he quotes her, each time the term according to its their kind occurs, it is believed to convey the idea that there were two or more groups that comprise the broad category mentioned. Therefore, quote, it cannot be supported linguistically that the kinds Noah took on the ark have a one-to-one correspondence to the kinds that God created in Genesis 1. Now, I disagree with that. I've done a whole video on that. I'll let you go watch that or listen to that podcast if you'd like. I disagree with Leitner extensively on that topic. And I think Arment does to a certain extent as well. But Arment is bringing up the post-flood flood boundary because he's trying to push the KT boundary. That's Arment's position. And he's done a paper on this before where he's talked about using baraminology to argue for the KT flood boundary. And I don't know anything about flood boundaries, but I do know bad arguments when I see them, and this is one bad argument. All right, so he puts forward three possible options. All right, here are his options. Scenario 1, all created kinds being represented equally but minimally on the ark. So in other words, the created kinds are basically identical to the ark kinds, and they're represented at either 2 or 7, depending on whether they're clean or unclean, or 7 pairs, depending on which translation you read. Option 2, all distinctive branches within each created kind being represented equally on the ark. So this is more of a Leitner-esque position, where there are multiple branches of diversification that have occurred post-creation, and that all of those branches are represented on the ark. And then option 3, each created kind represented some by multiple distinct branches on the ark. So each of these leads to conclusions. Now here are his conclusions that he draws from this. For scenario number 1, the conclusion is as follows. The men represented by each... Okay, this is very, very badly worded. The men represented each of the Baraminomic lineages created during the creation week. A clean created kind could be represented by more than one biologically distinct branch, up to 7 pairs, while an unclean created kind could be represented by a single pair. So the ark kinds would have essentially been the same as the created kinds. And by the way, this is a position I think is the most likely position. I think that based on the text of what it says in Genesis 7 and 9. Again, we've done a podcast on that too, so we'll skip over that for now. It's possible that some created kinds had disappeared by the time of the flood, just as some created kinds disappeared during or soon after the flood. And again, that's true too. For these scenarios, created kinds are those extant at the time of the flood. So that's scenario 1. That's the one I find most likely. Here are the other 2 scenarios. The men represented each biologically distinct branch that had arisen within each of the created kinds by the time of the flood. If the created kind generally equates to the family level, each branch would be approximately genus level or lower. There would be more arc kinds than created kinds. And option 3, the men represented some but not all distinctive branches arising from within each of the created kinds by the time of the flood. If the created kind generally equates to the family level, each branch would approximate genus level or lower. There would be more than one branch present on the ark, and at least one unclean created kind, and more than 7 branches present in at least one clean created kind. Not all branching lineages present at the time of the flood would be represented. Leitner suggested that these would be visually distinct lineages to Noah, thus there would be more ark kinds than created kinds. Now, I think the Leitner position would be some combination of 2 or 3, and I disagree with that position. Again, you can go watch that podcast. I don't want to go over that all over again. And Arment does raise some good objections to that point, but his primary argument has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fossil record and the crossing over of genera from across the Pliocene-Pleistocene boundary, because he looks at suborder Ruminata, which is a part of order Artodactyla, which is the clean mammals, and he attempts to argue that because there are a ton of genera that have fossils on both sides of the flood post-flood boundary, that Leitner is wrong, and that the flood post-flood boundary must be down at the KT boundary. I don't think this is a good argument. And I don't think this is a good argument for a number of reasons. All right, and if you want to read the paper, it's linked in the video description. There's a giant list. And he wants to argue that the KT boundary is the correct boundary. Now, I would argue that this is not accurate. Now, here's his conclusion. I'll just read part of the conclusion, then I'll address his argument. From the data gathered, we can conclude that the assertion by Leitner that, quote, it is not necessarily a problem if multiple genera cross the proposed post-flood boundary, unquote, is inaccurate. There is no leeway within the fossil record to pick and choose which pre-flood genera might have been on the ark. Such substantial increase in boundary crossing genera at the proposed upper Cenozoic flood post-flood boundary contradicts options 1 and 3. Proponents of the upper Cenozoic flood post-flood boundary models need to recognize that their models necessitate that the ark kind must be at the genus level or lower, which is option 2. Now, and he goes on and cites a couple of his own papers, saying that, and also some papers by Marcus Ross, shocker, that biostratigraphic, I don't know why I can't say that word, biostratigraphic arguments show that these things are improbable. No, they don't. And I would argue that Marcus Ross, and I don't know anything about Chad Arment's background, but Marcus Ross is a paleontologist. He is utterly ignorant of genetics, I would suspect. And I don't know anything about Arment's background, but he doesn't really get into any genetics in this paper. And I think that that's their undoing here. Because, as it turns out, genetics is somewhat determinative. If you have the genes for dark hair, then you're going to have dark hair. If you have genes for certain physical traits, you're going to most likely have those physical traits. Okay? And I can't go into a full-blown genetics lesson here, I don't have time, but the point being that genetics is somewhat determinative. If you have the genetics for trait X, then your kids are probably going to have at least have the traits for trait X, particularly if you're homozygous for it. Which leads to some very obvious conclusions. If there was diversification pre-flood, and there probably was, by the way, I'm not disagreeing with Arment on that. I believe that Arment has that correct, that there was probably diversification pre-flood. In fact, I've heard even people saying there might have been breeding going on the ark, particularly with fast reproducing kinds like mice and so on. There might have been breeding going on the ark. So you may have even had genera getting off the ark that didn't go on. Just think about that one for a few seconds. But because genetics is determinative, or at least somewhat determinative in terms of traits, what that means is that if genus X has developed pre-flood, then it is likely that genus X will develop post-flood too. And I'll cite an example for you. There is an organism that has come back from extinction. There's an organism that has come back from extinction. It's an island bird. So the term for this bird is oh goodness, it's a type of rail, if I remember correctly. Let me look it up. It is the white-throated rail. The white-throated rail. It originated on the Aldabra Atoll in the Indian Ocean, and was supposedly wiped out a long time ago, but then came back, supposedly. Right? So what it's effectively saying is that we have fossils of this creature living on the Aldabra Atoll that was supposedly extinct when the atoll sunk, supposedly, but the rail is still there. So the evolutionary model says that we can have species regenerate. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that the Aldabra rail necessarily came back from the dead. It may not have come back from the dead. There may be a more accurate explanation for that. I don't know. But the point being, genetics predicts that you can get the same species over again if you get the same combination of traits. And there are a limited number of these traits. You can only create a certain number of traits, a certain number of combinations of traits. And those genera are likely going to come back into existence because, again, you have a limited number of traits to start with. And I'll also point out, if we assume created heterozygosity and natural processes, which is the Jeanson and Weil model for post-flood diversification of organisms, post-creation diversification of organisms, this makes complete sense. The organisms that went on the ark would have been highly diverse, and then as they came off the ark, and by the way, the ruminants would have been the clean animals, so you might have had as many as 14 of each ruminant kind on the ark, assuming that their kinds are, that min equals kind, it doesn't equal genus, that the ark kinds are the same as the creative kinds. I'm making that assumption. So it's just assuming that within each ruminant kind, these are probably the clean kinds, according to Arment's own argument. So there would have been much more diversity available going onto the ark and coming off of the ark. Now, what does all that mean? What that means is that you're very, very, very likely to have created the same genera that you had prior to coming on the ark. Because you can only mix and match genetics the same certain number of ways. And you can do this, by the way, you can do this with people, not with genera, they're not going to create new genera, but you can, if you mix and match human genetics from the same groups of people, you will get people who look similar. This is why siblings look similar. Okay? This is why even cousins look similar. Because you're mixing and matching DNA from the same people or related people. So if you have, I don't know, we'll use antelope. If you take an antelope onto the ark, the antelope kind onto the ark, and the antelope kind comes off the ark, it might diversify into the same genera that existed when it went on the ark. Especially if a lot of the habitats ended up being similar. The same selection pressures were applied. Now, again, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Mr. Arment here. But Mr. Arment, this argument is bad. It is very, very bad from a genetics and natural and selective perspective. You need to rethink this. And I'm rather surprised that no editor for the ARJ noticed this. That no editor said, hey, that argument's weak. Did you have Kurt Wise and Marcus Ross review it? Because those are the people who believe in the lower flood boundary, so they would be okay with this. They think that was a good argument. And neither of them know very much about genetics because they're both paleontology people. And again, I'm not ripping on them for not knowing anything about genetics. I'm just pointing it out. The point here being, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm not trying to rip Mr. Arment. I don't know Mr. Arment. I don't know anything about Mr. Arment. The only thing I know is he's published a couple of papers along these same lines, and he keeps making the same error. Right? He keeps making the same mistakes. From a genetics perspective, from the perspective of diversification, speciation, etc., it is very likely that you will get the same genera after a bottleneck. You might get some differences depending on what comes through the bottleneck, but if you assume that the animals that went on the ark were highly diverse, which most creationists do just as a matter of course to generate all the diversity that we get post-flood, then it's very, very simple to get all the diversity that we see in organisms today and in the fossil record through genetics. It's not that complicated. And it's certainly not got a problem for a higher flood boundary, having multiple genera that are the same on both sides of the flood boundary. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that it's not expected. Because from a genetics perspective, I expect it. Like, it doesn't matter. I expect to find genera that's the same on both sides of the flood boundary. Wherever the flood boundary happens to be. I'm not really taking a position on that because I'm not a geologist. I'm kind of, to a certain extent, forced into the Clary camp because most of the people who are swallowing everything the evolutionists say are in the other camp. But again, I don't have a strong position on this one way or the other. I can be convinced either way because I'm not a geologist. I don't know. But this particular argument, this one particular argument, is very bad. This does not work, Mr. Arment. This does not work. And if you want to sit down with me and talk about this, we can have a conversation. And I know you've done extensive data digging in the paleontology databases. That's great. I'm glad you're doing that. Thank you for doing that, as a matter of fact. Not enough creationists spend time doing that kind of work, so thank you for doing it. I'm not trying to rip on you, but this argument is bad. I think there's probably a lot of good data to be mined out of those paleontology databases. I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm probably not going to be able to really use it. But I think there's a lot of good data there. But this argument against a high post-flood boundary is not a good one. Right? Genetics being what it is, and recombination being what it is, you won't get identical individuals, but you will get similar or the same genera. And remember, genera is not the lowest level. There's going to be some variation within genera. Things that are in the same genera might not look completely the same. And of course, there's, sexual dimorphism and so on. So even if you don't get exactly identical traits, it might be close enough to say this is the same genera. And you're also as I've just kind of thought of as I'm going through this, you're kind of making an assumption here that all those classifications are correct. Now, a lot of them probably are, but you have to remember that evolutionists have crafted whole dinosaur genera out of a single tooth. And I'm not joking, they've done that. Okay? So just remember, too, that just because we have a genera that exists supposedly on both sides of the Pliocene-Pleistocene, which is where the upper-level flood boundary is, doesn't mean that the genera actually exists on both sides, A, and B, it also doesn't mean that the genera actually exists, period. It could have been made from a single tooth. I think there's potential in this research, but the current way it's being argued is not nearly deep enough. You need to go deeper, figure out, okay, what fossil evidence do we actually have for each of these groups? Is it solid? If it's not solid, then maybe we need to reevaluate the argument. And from the basis of genetics, you definitely need to reevaluate the argument. All right? Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. There will hopefully be more creation biology content coming soon. There's also going to be more content hopefully coming out on the In His Image channel as well. So definitely subscribe to both, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next episode.